Welcome, guys. How's it going? And welcome to our, I guess we're calling it, the Hypertrophy for Functional Fitness webinar, or a webinar that's really exploring the marriage of bodybuilding concepts with functional fitness, CrossFit, and really performance. And Marcus and I are two people that are you're super passionate about this. We love talking about it and learning about it. And we kind of started going back and forth and having these conversations online and privately. And every time we get done, we would say, oh shit, we should have recorded that because
Right. Yeah.
it's coming out. So we decided that what we would do is come up with a litany of some really basic broad scope questions that we both commonly get with regard to our methods, our practice, and how we integrate these two things together, almost as like a seminal teaser that each one obviously has infinite layers that you could kind of go down, but just to kind of cover a wide scope of how this stuff works. My goal today is to kind of start you guys off with some basic physiology and understanding of the process of hypertrophy and how the body adapts and its value within the context of functional fitness. Then we'll talk about lots of different methods that Marcus and I use to be able to blend it together within the context of what we're trying to achieve with athletes. And then we'll even go down into programming and different ways that we can kind of program for that. And we'll finish up with obviously another important piece of this, which is nutrition and all the different avenues that you can go down with nutrition, depending on what you're trying to achieve from it. So the first big question that is just kind of sets the stage for all of this is understanding what is the value of combining hypertrophy and bodybuilding work with performance training and general physical fitness, GPP, CrossFit, or just the idea of the expression of athleticism, not just how you look, but how well you can use it. And for those of you guys who may be unfamiliar with some of the terminology here, hypertrophy describes one way that cells adapt to stress. When a cell increases in size beyond its normal size, it's gone through hypertrophy. And this can occur a number of different ways, through hormonal stimulation, inflammation, or an increased workload. But when we talk about hypertrophy, essentially what we're talking about is an increase in size of muscle tissue. So Marcus, for this question, this first one, like, hey, what is the value of combining these two things together? I know we each kind of have an individual list of things that we think about. What are some of the things that you start off with when you're deciding, what is really the utility of this stuff and why we would put it within context?
Well, first, I just want to say hello to the audience. If this is predominantly a Thundrbro, Dave Lipson audience and your first time meeting me, I'm Marcus. Do a lot of work in something I call functional bodybuilding, which is really a marriage of these concepts. And yeah, happy to be here. And my goal today is to really, actually, it's related to this first question, which is that I kind of talked to Dave about seeing that if you want to call functional fitness and you really want to go to like the extreme of CrossFit sport and put it over in this category, and then over here there's hypertrophy training and bodybuilding sport and stage preparedness over here. Everything in the middle of that, there's this big spectrum that's kind of in between. And what we're finding, and I think what Dave and I both see, is that the vast majority of clients that we work with are not necessarily going into one of those buckets extremely. They're wanting to be somewhere in the middle. Some people want a perfect blend of both. Some people want a little bit more performance-based training, call it CrossFit. Some people want more hypertrophy, but there's finding a marriage. And a lot of clients will not feel satisfied if they're doing one thing without the other. And so that right there is a huge value point to even having this discussion, is that if somebody wants it, we have to be able to prescribe it in a way that makes sense and that actually enhances the overall experience. And I think that that's inherent in what we've both learned, over the course of several years of designing programs like this, is that you can get, even more value out of your performance if you're on this side of the spectrum by adding in hypertrophy work. And if you're doing hypertrophy focused training and you're wanting to look good and build muscle, then there's actually a huge value of putting in some, GPP or mixed modal training, performance style CrossFit training too.
Can I pause you there for a second? Obviously, I'm so sorry. Marcus isn't even doing himself justice, because for those of you guys who don't know him, he's a big deal. He's competed at the CrossFit Games at a high level. He obviously has a huge following, not just tied to his, athletic ability and physique, but also his athletic performance and knowledge, and that's this huge following he has in his company, which is Revival Fitness, but really the brand is functional bodybuilding. And our stories parallel each other with how we landed here. We got to the point where we just wanted to train and look good and not be hurt, but still be functional. Because the old way of just pouring intensity on intensity with us led us down the road of injury and plateau. And at a certain point, like a lot of you guys out there probably, it was just too much. And it wasn't really serving our goals.
Thanks for adding that in.
Yeah.
But to get into some of the specifics that we kind of talked about prior to this recording, there's a big, there's the bodybuilding and the hypertrophy work, the building the training volume and getting the contractions necessary under your belt, where you build tendon strength, you build muscle size, strength. All of that needs to precede doing very high skilled dynamic contractions in, let's say, a sport like CrossFit, or even a fitness method like CrossFit. So, it is been researched a lot, and I've been studying this for years, is that unless you build basic strength, going into doing dynamic Olympic lifting, kipping gymnastics, if you kind of leapfrog those early steps of building base strength, you are vulnerable to injury, to plateaus, and to burnout. So this is sort of like building the underlying function before you take, aggressive steps towards moving towards like performance, or, what is being called GPP, but it's high intensity mixed modal fitness.
Yeah. And like, for this question, this is kind of like my original argument here, like why hypertrophy? I have three main answers. And the first one, from the performance standpoint, is, being in the world of professional athletics as a baseball player, getting to train lots of pro athletes, getting to see CrossFitters, I can tell you right off the bat that form tends to follow function. So, for instance, there's a reason why, the athletes you see at the CrossFit Games have big quad sweeps and big shoulders and six-pack abs. There's a reason why, the Major League Baseball MVP, Mike Trout, is this well-muscled hulk of a dude. And it's because, there's a connection there. Now, whether it's their physical body that allows them to express their athleticism so well, whether it's a product of the training that gives them that physique, it really doesn't matter. The only thing we need to understand is that athletes tend to look like athletes, and the way that they use their machine is limited by the size and capacity of their physical body, regardless of how naturally gifted they are athletically. And it kind of brings up a question, and you guys may have heard these different models before, of understanding, the neurological adaptations an athlete can have versus the biological adaptations, or what I call the hardware versus the software. So if you think about, let's see, pieces of technology, like a hardware is the actual machine. So in the case of a computer, it's the computer size, its processing power that gives it its potential. Now the software allows it to recognize that power. It allows it to do different programs and allows it to work efficiently. So what we're talking about here is, especially within the context of performance, so many people get great at being so efficient at using their hardware. They can find every single way to cheat and get every ounce of advantage out of their muscle tissue, whether it be a small athlete doing a double bodyweight deadlift, or somebody who can crank out 100 kipping pull-ups. But oftentimes that really gets tapped out, and they've never been able to actually build their physical body to be able to continue to progress. They're just kind of so focused on their technique and those neurological capacities that they sometimes neglect just the biological development. The other big argument I have is just for the sake of orthopedic health. By fortifying joints, by targeting things that are common areas of breakdown that you guys all know, broken down shoulders and backs and hips and knees, by actually getting hypertrophy, we're able to build better security and stability around these joints to be able to safely express that neurological capacity. And I've seen it myself as an athlete who's been through terrible back issues and back surgery. The first step in my rehabilitation was finding a way to train that I could see progress and not be hurt anymore. And hypertrophy was something that completely opened up my mind, where it was no longer about lifting as heavy as possible or going as fast as possible, but getting muscles to a specific state to create that hypertrophic effect, working on the right internal chemistry, and targeting movement in a different type of way, where maybe the movement was more controlled, or maybe we were using something like tempos or isometrics or overload eccentrics, that it wasn't kind of about my score on the board. It was really about what I was doing to my muscles to elicit a response. And then finally, there's that argument Marcus made where, 99.9% of people that ever walk in a gym are going there for the same two reasons, because I want to look good and I want to feel good. And one of the experiences I had is because of the people I was surrounded with, because I was surrounded with CrossFit Games athletes and the CrossFit headquarters staff, I was almost getting peer pressured into their goals and into their methods of training, because, you're the average of all those people around you. And a lot of this is about redefining intensity, where intensity is not just about how much work you could do and how fast you could do it, but intensity can also be about challenging the muscle in a lot of different ways, which is in a lot of cases safer. In the case of hypertrophy, we were discussing how athletes have so much more ability to spend more time in hypertrophy and bodybuilding work versus the amount of time they can elicit to high intensity work, or what they're able to handle. And that personal gratification of being able to wear the work on your body, because at the end of the day, I just want to look good and be functional and be able to work athletically. Maybe the goal is not to be the fittest person on earth, but your training program should be serving your goals. So if most people want that, we should be creating programs that are serving them and delivering it.
I want to add a couple like real examples to the hardware versus software conversation. And as a coach that was coaching CrossFit for years, people were often attracted to the sexy lifts or the sexy gymnastic movements. So I don't know anybody that ever came into the gym that didn't want to muscle up, or if they did want it and they didn't say it, like they were just maybe scared to announce that to the world. But if I took two people on any given day of the week and I was going to try and coach them in a muscle up, the person that could do 10 to 15 strict pull-ups but had no concept of what a muscle up was versus the person that could do one strict pull-up or zero, I eventually could get them each there. But it's going to be a big hill to climb with the person that doesn't have a single strict pull-up, because they don't have that hardware, that base strength underneath to start to develop those, more advanced gymnastics. And you can see it every year in the open, people that are getting their first muscle up on open workout, whatever. And you ask them, they struggle to get that. They are successful because they can put together the dynamic, contraction with the kipping and so forth. And they don't have that underlying base strength of strict strength, versus the person who's got 15 strict pull-ups. In 2 sessions, you learn a little bit of the software, and next thing you know, they have that muscle up. So bodybuilding and hypertrophy work can often be the base level of strength building required to build up some of those underlying strength characteristics for people. Yeah. And then on the orthopedic health and longevity point, what I think is interesting to note is that, if we're using CrossFit athletes as an example, every year after the CrossFit Games, if you look at the training of most of the successful athletes that have been there year after year, there's like a 3-month window after the CrossFit Games in historical timeframes where training essentially looks like bodybuilding. And so when I finished my competitive career in 2016, I was as beat up and broken as I'd ever been from essentially 7 years of continual, training for the sport. And what I did was I spent 4 months using bodybuilding principles to rebuild myself. And it was at that time that I truly got connected to this idea of functional bodybuilding has a place in pretty much everyone's life who wants a little bit of both of these worlds.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about this idea of breaking away from the idea that intensity is a cure-all for everything, right? There's just more intensity. Intensity is the best way to get there. Kind of what you were saying with the example of the muscle up, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should, and certainly doesn't mean that you should live there in that very, very top end of the spectrum every single time you train, because obviously we know the pitfalls of that. And even the things we're talking about, the common players like speed and load and complexity that we know have an association with higher risk and more injury. Maybe that's somewhere we visit every once in a while, but we spend the majority of the time building the body and still giving it exposure to those athletic endeavors on a broad spectrum. Okay, so we're gonna move on to question number 2 now, which is more about like the application of this stuff. So what are some ways you can integrate bodybuilding and functional fitness with general physical preparedness, performance, or CrossFit? And Marcus and I have 2 different answers on that. The first one I would say, and this is kind of the real indicator, is, what specifically does the athlete want and how fast do they want to achieve it? To give you an example, if somebody said, hey, I'd like to put on as much size as I can, as quick as I can, well, that probably dictates the nature of the program, right? That probably points to a program that's much more specific. We use a process called the SAID principle, specific adaptations to an imposed demand, where we're narrowing the scope of the training to really target hypertrophy and what we might call a dedicated hypertrophy program. And that might be where the only thing the athlete is doing is just using, these methods we're going to talk about to be able to elicit muscles to grow. Maybe there's not as much conditioning work. Maybe there isn't as much fast lifting or complexity, but it's literally just about trying to target that specific adaptation because we know that's the quickest path. Another common thing that, athletes often underestimate is if you're trying to be functional, but you're interested in bodybuilding or hypertrophy, one of the easiest things you can do is just the selection of the movements you're using. Typically bodybuilders might use a lot of isolation movements or a lot of machines or a lot of movements that kind of take away the athletic application of loading and moving. Well, the first thing you can do is use the same movements that you use, the pulling movements, the squatting movements, the pressing movements, but we're doing them a specific way or manipulating them to target hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead,
I'm
Mark.
sorry to just jump in here, but I mean, without oversimplifying what the approach of our functional bodybuilding programs is, I could just simply say that we've taken some of these principles of hypertrophy training, which is, time under tension, repetition ranges, forced eccentrics, some concepts that have been proven over the years to work in building muscle, using what would a bodybuilder would do in perhaps like movement selection, but instead we've been replacing it with push presses, with thrusters, with everything from the various squats and even pulling movements like in the Olympic lifts, just implementing some of those tempo principles. So the selection of movement can actually make it feel more athletic because now you're incorporating again, maybe like a broader spectrum of movement patterns and even rotational elements that might not show up in a traditional bodybuilding program.
Yeah, and that really is like, that's just the selection of movements right there. Now, obviously, what people sometimes make the assumption of is when you talk about bodybuilding with functional fitness, they mean, what do you think, bicep curls? And you're like, oh, no. It's not about what you're doing. It's about how you're doing it and using some of those principles that Marcus mentioned. Now, obviously, even within there, we know that something like bicep curls does have a context, but it's not the main thing. You're never going to cure metabolic disease with bicep curls, but it does have a place in a program. It just needs to be applied strategically so that we're keeping the main thing, we're keeping functionality, the main piece, and we're just manipulating it. And I think of the way you kind of blend this with a program is really on a spectrum. So if we're talking about the most extreme would be just dedicated hypertrophy and nothing else, that's your quickest path to size and muscle growth. Well, the next closest thing might be something really similar to what Marcus and I do with a lot of our programs, which is creating a hybrid program where essentially we have some really legit bodybuilding pieces, at the beginning or the end of each day. And then we introduce, a more broader conditioning or GPP or CrossFit piece in there, in addition to the pure hypertrophy. And that is...
Last month we released a program called Functional Body Composition, which was sort of a take on German body composition from Charles Poliquin. And it was basically just that. It was like a very focused, dedicated hypertrophy, true bodybuilding, dedicated phase of each training session, followed by something that was would be more familiar to somebody in the GPP CrossFit audience. And on top of that, and I was going to add this one thing, is that, incorporating bodybuilding principles into GPP conditioning is something that I think is a new concept to a lot of people. And that's something we use a lot of. one of the challenges that people face with functional fitness, GPP, or CrossFit when they do it for a long time and they get quite good at it is that they now have the ability to really push high levels of intensity, which can be a huge drain on the nervous system, hormones, and just beat them up. So one of the things that we end up having to fight against is how do we bring people's intensity in those conditioning or metcons down? And one of the ways that we can do it is actually injecting little bits of bodybuilding principles into, a 5 rounds for time, which is kind of a concept that people have been told for years is like, don't do anything to lower your power, keep your intensity high. Well, in fact, for some people and for many people, it's advantageous to turn that down a little bit so that they don't get so beat up, so that they can have a lot more fulfillment and personal gratification from the training. So the example would be like, it's 5 rounds for time of, rowing, some type of box jump, and then some type of isolation movement at a tempo so that you actually turn down a little bit of the speed and the noise that's going on with that high revving, stuff that you're doing next to it.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into the next one, which is just manipulating GPP or high intensity for the more hypertrophic effect. And you guys are familiar with some programs. Marcus gave you a great example. We have a good friend, Brian Fisher, who runs this. What's the name of his program? High Intensity?
Chalk Online. Yeah. Oh, High Intensity Bodybuilding. Yes.
So what he does is it's the workout is the workout, but the way you're doing the workout is changing. So, here's an example. Like, for instance, let's say we were doing Fran. Well, maybe it's Fran, but, it's Fran with a 3-second negative on the descent of the thruster with a 1-second pause at the top of each rep, or maybe it's Fran with strict pull-ups controlling a negative. Now it's essentially the same workout, but there's a lot more time under tension, and obviously, like, I feel like in a lot of cases, slower and more controlled is often more harder. I know that the power equation may be going down a little bit, but think about some of the subjective measures of how challenging this feels, and just the effect of that. Marcus said we're just basically spreading out the intensity and taking it away from one place and just placing it in another place that we might not spend as much time. And the least invasive way to do it. Oh, go ahead, Marcus.
I was just going to say, I would never get in like in a room with a coach that's trying to prepare somebody for CrossFit and tell them, hey, we're going to do Fran in this way and you do it that way, and it's the same thing. Of course it's not. Like, it is all about intent, right? If the intent is let's build some hypertrophy elements into a conditioning piece, we can manipulate it and change it. But the great part of that is that we still preserve some of the same movements. We preserve some of the same concepts of like, let's say, descending rep schemes, which can, be of huge value just mentally for people to get through conditioning work. So it's not the intent, but it is the intent that is changing. Even though workouts can start to look the same, how you feel when you do it and the outcome changes dramatically if these principles are implemented correctly.
Yeah, and the least invasive way to do this is, like, if you're an athlete out there and you love your affiliate, you don't want to change the program at all, you're just doing the pure CrossFit program, the easiest thing you can do without really interjecting too much change to the program is just placing maybe a hypertrophy finisher after your workout. That's something that you might typically do in lieu of skill work. Maybe it's just 10 minutes of hypertrophy work targeting a specific muscle or a specific movement function. Oftentimes we recommend in cases that maybe correlate with the movements you use. So if you did a workout like Diane with deadlifts and handstand push-ups, maybe it's additional shoulder pressing work using some of the methods we're going to talk about next, and just how we're trying to elicit that hypertrophic response. So really a spectrum, right? And that just boils down to, like, what do you want? How fast do you want it? And that'll dictate how intense we need to dive into this stuff, or the balance between how much bodybuilding versus how much just general fitness work that we're doing. And I can tell you, like, it's a great break for people. It's a mental break to feel like when you're training, there's no value really placed on like, your how you place that day on the board. Like, it's not about how fast you could do it or how heavy you could lift. It's a nice way to kind of take the pressure off, where it's just about being able to hit these things and create a specific state in the muscle to help it grow. So here is the one, and this next one is, if you guys are coaches, I really recommend you take your notebooks out for this, because these are kind of the big principles that Marcus and I like to use in a question that is like, what type of methods should I use to get muscle hypertrophy? And we're going to dive into a bunch of different things here. There's a little bit of science. What I'd like to do is kind of dissect the science and translate it to you in layman's terms, and then talk about the training factors that directly correlate with them. So there are some specific mechanisms that really help drive that muscle growth, and there are things you guys may have heard anecdotally before. There are three that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to kind of speak with Marcus as to kind of what this looks like in terms of his training. But the three principles I'm going to talk about is heavy mechanical loading, muscle micro tearing or muscle damage, and metabolic stress in the muscle. Mechanical loading refers to the magnitude, the duration, and the frequency at which you're contracting muscles. Muscles are very smart. They have little tiny mechanosensors inside them that communicate with your brain to say, exactly how heavy this weight is, how long the muscle is being stretched. These signals are sent instantaneously, and their examples are things like Golgi tendon organelles in muscles that tell you and really create that communication process. And when your muscles are exposed to loading that it's not used to, loading magnitude, right? So you're contracting muscles or placing a load in it that it's unaccustomed to, loading frequency where you're holding that tension longer than you're normally accustomed to, maximum force production, right? These neurological responses are amazing for muscle growth. And, when we're talking about this, I know you guys who do strength training or powerlifting may think, okay, like a 1 rep max. Well, that's one way, but for the sake of hypertrophy, really the sweet spot for this stuff is going to be that 8 to 12 rep range in terms of having enough duration and frequency of loading to create those types of responses and to create what kind of comes down the line in the form of muscle damage. So there are lots of ways you can do this. One way you can do it is by increasing the time under tension you have in a muscle. And you notice Marcus and I use things like, we talk about things like tempos, right? So when a muscle is lengthening against a contraction, when you're, say, controlling the descent of a squat, this is amazing for challenging the time under tension of a muscle to manipulate those mechanosensors. I love using things called overload eccentrics, where an athlete is basically lowering more weight than they can actually press up or win in the concentric portion where a muscle is shortening. Even different types of grips, different types of equipment, different types of loading, adding things like bands to movement, different planes of motion. I know we're probably all used to doing pull-ups with the same grip and the same width. We probably do a lot of sagittal pressing and things like bench pressing and pull-ups. But as soon as you ask an athlete to do like a wide grip behind the neck pull-up, or you ask an athlete to do an incline chest press, all of a sudden, just due to the fact that the nature of the movement is unaccustomed to, is great for creating that neurological muscle growing response. So Marcus, what are some of the ways that you like to challenge that mechanical loading within your program for yourself and for your athletes?
A lot of the things that you said already, but I think one that you haven't really talked too much about yet is loading implements and getting outside of just the normal barbell, work that most people have become familiar with using CrossFit training programs or GPP programs. And I know kettlebells show up in GPP programs, but outside of a swing, there's not much that gets done with it, right? A couple of years ago, we got introduced to dumbbells. We saw that take over, but again, still in a very small subset of movements, like the dumbbell snatch and a dumbbell lunge and a dumbbell box step over or step up. So by using different implements, and then, like you said, adding in bands, or even using things like earthquake bars or different types of implements that have that are just going to have a different neurological stimulus on people, and then change sort of like the mechanical stress from just like when you do dumbbell bench pressing versus kettlebell bench pressing, that actually changes where you feel the load distributed on your triceps and your delts versus your chest. And so changing up small things like that, what it does is it helps. What I found a lot is that everybody has got a emotional connection to their barbell bench press or their barbell back squat. They have less of an emotional connection to their kettlebell front rack squat or their glute bridge kettlebell bench press, right? Same movement patterns, going to accomplish a similar net goal, which is increasing strength and hypertrophy in those muscle groups, but Now you take out this emotional component where you're comparing it to your 1 rep max or your 5 rep max that you've seen for the last 6 years. And when you don't get that number on a back squat, you start to feel down on yourself. Okay, well, let's just change up the squat pattern and the loading pattern with a different implement and get you focused back on the actual muscle contractions, the quality of them, and then sticking to things like tempo, where you can just totally just, phase out that whole ego that's like, I gotta lift 315 pounds today, otherwise I'm just no good.
Yeah, and I want to give you guys a lot of tools, but just to kind of piggyback, and this is a great story, Marcus, we have our original 90-day Get Huge program, which is all tempos and truncated rest periods. And without a doubt, every single time, our partner Jason probably gets 10 of these emails a day saying like, hey, if I can do more weight, but I can't hold the tempo or the rest period.
Right.
He's like, well, no, that's why the program works, is because of the tempo and because of the rest period. So if you just want to, hump a barbell, that's one thing, but we're trying to grow muscle here. Some other things that, I kind of alluded to, but just specific mechanisms that I've had a lot of success with personally with athletes are things like partials. So a partial rep is a truncated portion of the range of motion. So that could be something like, in the case, I'll use bench press a lot because I think a lot of us understand, the plane of movement of a bench press. That could be partial tops. So, from the lockout halfway down up, it could be partial bottoms from the bottom of the movement to halfway up. It could be a combination of all those, where maybe we do something like 5 tops, 5 bottoms, and 5 fulls. But those have a lot of utility because you can move more weight in a partial rep than you can in a full rep. And it's a way to get more loading. Every time we write a program, I will put in the exercise, this is your heavy mechanical loading exercise, so that athletes understand if the bar ain't bending, you're just pretending. The goal here is heavy and challenging to the point where you're not so sure if you might be able to get those last 1 or 2 reps, because that's the intent of the stimulus. And even having said that, it's still markedly different than they say something like a 1 or a 3 rep max, because our rep ranges are in that 8 to 12 rep range, which is kind of taking people out of that danger zone in terms of their maximal loading, because again, the goal is muscle growth. And I don't know.
I was kind of giggling when you were starting to talk about partial reps, because these are bro reps for yeah. I mean it's actually has a real utility in this conversation. Some of the other ones that came to mind for me were drop sets, cluster sets, and then very focused non-complementary supersets. So I'll start with that one, which is like, in many of our programs, it's doing supersets where one movement after the next targets the same muscle group. But you start with something that's like high threshold, pulling a lot of motor units together to get a big contractile force. So maybe like a heavy partial bench, or like a rack pull on a dead. And then you move into the next exercise, which is a little bit of a step down, and it might be dumbbell bench to a full range. And then the last one might be going right into a push-up, which again, it's like bench, dumbbell, push-up, all 3 hitting the same horizontal plane push. Yeah. But you can actually, with very short rest periods, you can accumulate a decent amount of time under tension and move from something that's really difficult down to something that's easier. And it's essentially doing like a drop set, but using movement selection to get you there.
And that's like a perfect segue into the next mechanism, which is metabolic stress. And what you guys are hearing from Marcus is what sometimes people in CrossFit refer as like movement redundancy. So it's not like a push with a pull, but it's a push with a push, maybe with another push, this mechanism we're going to talk about, metabolic stress, refers to the acute buildup of some of the byproducts of exercise and muscle contraction. So things like hydrogen, like lactate, they build up in the muscle when you're doing high volume contractions, or like you're saying, you're now moving from that 8 to 12 rep range to now you're moving from that maybe 15 to 30 to even 50 rep range. What's happening is that by truncating rest periods, so you're not resting the full recovery, by performing a larger amount of reps and durations that are now lasting anywhere from 30 to 100 seconds long, these things start to build up, and they actually create acute hypoxia in the muscle. That's a lack of oxygen, because hydrogen and lactate are building up. This is where you hear people talking about how the muscle is getting full, or if you've ever seen the movie Pumping Iron, Arnold's talking about the pump. And there's actually an increased volumization of muscles, not just intercellular, but intracellular, as all these factors are just getting pushed into muscle. Now, this is really advantageous for muscle hypertrophy, and really the science is not quite clear as to why it works so well, but we know that there are some protein enzymatic responses and even hormone production that occurs when this type of stress happens. And if you guys have ever heard of training such as like occlusion training, where they're actually cinching off blood flow to muscle to exacerbate this buildup of metabolites, this is a way to kind of manipulate that. Not that I recommend that kind of training, because what Marcus is talking about is way simpler and probably a little bit safer. But this is what's happening inside the muscle to create those anabolic factors to help it grow. So one thing you could do to elicit this in the terms of training are, he mentioned things like drop sets. And a drop set, you can kind of call it maybe progressive scaling, where you go from a hard movement and you're just kind of making it easier as you go to continue to work. This could look like a weighted pull-up into max banded pull-ups. Sure, you could put tempos on it. That probably makes it even harder. This could look like supersets as attacking similar muscles from different aspects. So I like to do trisets, where maybe it's an incline bench press into a dip into a tricep press down, right? And you're just kind of hammering triceps on triceps on triceps. The weights are generally going to be lighter usually. The reps are going to be higher. The amount of time working is going to be longer. And these are just some ways to manipulate that. But as long as you understand the concept of what you're trying to attain here, and I'll tell athletes like, hey, if we're doing something like this, you should see your veins popping out of your arm somewhat. You should see an increased volume in your arm. If that's not happening, we probably need to manipulate the training to get maybe a little bit more intensity or a little bit less rest. Or even in some cases, it can be a nutritional thing where the cells are just not holding their volume due to a lack of muscle glycogen or something. But I know that like one of the things we talked about was like, sure, like you could create these CrossFit workouts where you're just hammering arms. It's just arms and arms and arms. And maybe you're not moving as fast, but you're getting massive metabolic stress in that muscle group. Another way you can kind of create metabolic stress, and this is all kind of due to time under tension, is doing work like band work. Band work is great because you can create a ton of metabolic stress without a ton of muscle damage, because it's something like a band. There's not a lot of loading through the eccentric where those muscles are lengthening, and we'll get to what muscle microtearing and muscle damage looks like next. But these are all different strategies you can implement: supersets, drop sets, even things like high rep band work. And I personally like to place these towards the end of the session, because what happens is as you become fatigued, you actually start pulling in additional motor units or pulling in additional muscle as motor units start to burn out. So this is another reason why metabolic stress is great for recruiting more muscle, because essentially you're just burning out these motor units and getting more and more, also getting better coordination between motor units when you hit this level of stress.
I think additionally, something that I've learned through high level competitive fitness, CrossFit fitness, is that in metabolic conditioning workouts where we're implementing an assault bike or a bike of that nature, or even a biker get high resistance, using ski ergs and then using rowing, if you couple those patterns into something like this to create metabolic stress while doing, let's say you're going to do some big tricep drop sets, and then at the end you're going to actually do an interval of ski erg, that can compound some of this metabolic stress in a specific area, where there's the similar muscle groups that are actually working. And so this can be like, these are some of the interval weight training sessions that will show up in some of our programs, where it's like we're going to do something like a floor press for 10 right into a tempo based ring push-up right into a hard ski. And those three, that triplet is really just hammering like the tricep extension pattern. And similarly with squats, doing a variety of different kettlebell rack squats into lunges into assault bike sprint, that too can create a tremendous amount of metabolic stress, which only as you've seen for CrossFit athletes, they go through a tremendous amount of hypertrophy, not because they're necessarily doing a lot of hypertrophy work, but they're doing a lot of volume of contractions under metabolic stress and eating a ton, which we'll get into kind of how you actually put on size, but that definitely plays a part.
Yeah, like, you know, this is what's attractive to me a lot of times in the case of like injury. Like even if you're doing strict work, you can get great hypertrophy with a light weight as long as you're creating that kind of stress. And all of this kind of has one common denominator, whatever it is. We're getting muscles close to failure. I had the privilege of talking with a mentor of mine, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, who wrote literally the book on hypertrophy, The Science of Muscle Hypertrophy. And he comes from more of the academic world, and he helps translate a lot of the science to me. But he explained this to me in the most bro layman's terms I've ever heard. The body wants to do one thing: survive. That's it. That's all it wants to do. So if you can create enough stress to force it to change because it wants to survive, because it has that level of mechanical loading, because you're putting that amount of metabolic stress on it to pull in more and more motor units, it will adapt. And obviously, you guys all know it's not a comfortable process, but it's just a different target than as heavy as you can or as fast as you can. This is where we start to incorporate some of the principles we're talking about. One other principle that is also great for metabolic stress and mechanical loading that we haven't really dived into that much is isometrics. So, you know, an example of incorporating isometrics into exercises that use metabolic stress could be something like, and I know Marcus loves doing this stuff with kettlebells, Tabata floor press, holding the weight in support. Now you're doing light reps to push blood into muscle, but then you're holding the muscle in an isometric contraction. That's where it's not shortening, it's not lengthening, but just holding still. And that's different ways you can kind of hybrid this stuff together. And just the variety is great. You want like to cast a wide net and not just use one principle. I have a personal opinion on what method is maybe a little bit more bang for your buck than others, but the wider net you cast, usually you're able to avoid things like plateau. It keeps the training really fun, and you're getting a wider breadth of adaptations, just exposing muscle to different principles. Or like Arnold says, you need to trick the muscle.
I want to just do a quick, this is going to be a slight tangent, but it's going to circle back and tie into some of this. I mean, the thing that I want people to understand is that, you know, you can't grow without putting in some really, really hard work. Okay. So hypertrophy, we're talking about different mechanisms to get there. It can be painful. It's just painful in a different way. Like you have to push a little bit into some discomfort to get these adaptations to happen. And what's really interesting to me is that over the years, you know, through CrossFit and coaching CrossFit, a world of people got introduced to the idea that training could be painful and enjoyable, right? Like they never got the exposure to like, man, this was hard. And oh man, it made me want to throw up. And oh, I actually kind of like that. Right. And so now fast forward many years, we've got a huge population of people that know that training is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to really push them to their limits, but the limit of pushing high intensity in a dynamic contraction, mixed modal fashion is beating them up. And now we're here to say, hey, well, come check out these bodybuilding principles, this hypertrophy work that can give you that same exact feeling of like, I am pushing myself into discomfort with a lot more safety behind it, because you're not putting yourself in the same 1RM maximal contraction under fatigue states that you were in the GPP CrossFit setting. And so it was like prior to CrossFit, people had tried bodybuilding and never really got like a lot of results or didn't really feel that real feeling, likely because they weren't following really great principles and had not yet understood that that's what it takes to actually see results. CrossFit was the segue to a lot of people to get into the pain and be like, oh, the pain's actually good, until it wasn't good. And now I'm looking for something that gives me that feeling without breaking me into, injury and yeah.
And
So
that's
sorry for that little tangent.
You know, it's hard to teach. It's really something that's earned over time. Is things like your pain thresholds increase, your rate of perceived exertion starts to decrease, where it just doesn't feel that hard. I've seen a lot of CrossFitters, my wife included, myself included, do really, really well at bodybuilding because they're not afraid to push themselves. It's just kind of putting in the bumper lanes to push themselves in the right way to get results and have it be safe. So I really love that, Marcus. That's a great anecdote right there. Okay, so last one we're going to talk about is muscle micro tearing or muscle damage. So muscle micro tearing refers to the acute damage that can occur within a muscle fiber. Muscle fiber has lots of different layers, but where we see a lot of muscle damage starts at the outer membrane sheath of the muscle in a layer known as the sarcolemma. And this is a permeable layer that allows nutrients in and out of the muscle fiber. And you end up with these really large tears in the sarcolemma that will eventually, if you give it the opportunity, heal, remodel, but because the body wants to survive, they remodel thicker. So that's where you get an increased thickness of muscle fibers due to that. Another place where we can see muscle damage occurring is at the smallest contractile unit of a muscle within the myosin and actin bonds. So the way muscles contract, if I could explain this really, really simply, muscle contraction theory centers around two proteins, myosin proteins and actin proteins. And these proteins attach to each other and shorten on both ends, bringing what they call a Z-line closer together. And the unit of a Z-line is termed as a sarcomere. So from Z-line to Z-line, you have these filaments that attach, and when they pull on each other, it's the Z-lines start to come closer to each other. And you can imagine in something like an eccentric movement where the muscle is lengthening and you're trying to resist that contraction, those myosin and actin bonds get highly stressed. And sure, they can damage, but when they damage, they heal, they remodel thicker, and they also remodel more numerous. So if you could imagine, like, let's say a piece of Velcro, if you guys have ever seen a piece of Velcro, there are these tiny hooks that attach together in Velcro. And I call that, like, let's use that as the analogy as the myosin and actin bonds. And when you damage them, when they heal, those little hooks are remodeling thicker, and there are more of them. So obviously that gives that muscle greater cross-sectional strength, a greater ability to contract and to contract harder with more force. That's why there's an analog between bigger and stronger, because a larger muscle has more contractile potential. Now, whether you're able to recognize that contractile potential or not is really based on your neurological capacity to fire those motor units, but that is the process in which the damage and recovery occurs, and why that damage is important to be able to get muscles to grow. And we alluded to it here. The best way to achieve that in terms of methods is eccentric movement under load. So we use tempos. Tempos can be anywhere from 3 to 5, sometimes even go all the way up to 10 seconds long. Movements that can really challenge that eccentric loading are things like overload eccentrics, where, like I mentioned, you can do movements where you're lowering more weight than you can press up. So obviously I'm doing a bench press here. You can see in the case of the bench press, that could look like a trainer or a spotter placing overpressure on top of the bar and then assisting up, or even doing things like forced reps where you're getting assistance to contract the muscle, but then you're lowering down controlled more weight than you can actually work against gravity. Any comments on that, Marcus?
Yeah. I mean, I love it. It's like I haven't actually been focused on the physiology of that since college and medical school, but really one of the other additional pieces to that is that, you know, when it gets right down to it, leveraging good tempo and following strict cadence within training while still pushing weights and not, like you said, going so heavy that you lose sight of what those tempos are. That is the way of actually enhancing these micro tears and this muscle damage. The other thing that it does too for people, and this is another reason why going into this type of training can be sort of a departure from the pain that people have experienced before, is that when you're moving under tempo and control, it's going to limit the total amount of load that you can actually, produce or work with in a particular exercise, which for many people keeps them safer. And by increasing time under tension, it gives your brain an opportunity to actually connect with the movement that you're doing and enhance motor control. And so actually you're building better mechanics, you're building better quality exercises and getting better positions, which overall tends to be safer for people and makes people feel more accomplished when they're training. It's like, man, I did that 1 rep max back squat, but I felt like I was all over the place. And, oh, but I did this tempo 5 rep at, a 4-1 X1 tempo. It was heavy, but man, I moved really well, and I didn't go into some knee valgus, really rounded back position. I felt really good, and it was still hard work.
Yeah. And like, a lot of this stuff, this method especially has so much utility, and I didn't believe it because I thought, well, it had to be heavy. And it doesn't always have to be heavy. In fact, Marcus knows I had a really devastating back surgery. I lost almost 30 pounds of muscle mass, hopped up on painkillers, unable to go to the bathroom or sleep for weeks on end. And my rehabilitation program was a program where I would do 8 sets of 8 reps in movements that would all have 3-second negatives and 30-second rest periods. And I was trying to exacerbate metabolic stress and have time under tension, but it was only 40% of my 1 rep max load. So I was so scared of injuring my back again, but the idea of like, hey, it's not that heavy, it's 40%, and it's controlled so I can really focus on stabilizing my spine. I saw great results with that. I was able to almost reclaim all that weight in about 12 weeks just doing that program. And it really opened my eyes to how effective that can be, especially if you've never trained that way before. And likewise, that's a great way to incorporate beginners into a program, to be like, hey, slow the movement down. It's great for building a foundation. It's going to keep them safer because they're controlling the movement there and it's not crazy heavy. And that's what I like to kind of use as kind of like the introductory part of like, welcome to hypertrophy, right? And that's kind of just the foundation of just understanding tempos and rest periods and how that moves. So don't you dare text me or DM me and ask me if you can lift more, should you follow the tempo or not do the rest. That's defeating the purpose.
And if I could also go back to when I was first introduced to coaching CrossFit, my first few years of coaching CrossFit, if I could go back and change anything, I would go back and bring in all of the new beginners, and I would make them just do lots of hypertrophy work in the same movements that they were trying to learn, but I would slow them down. I would give them more time under tension. They would learn how to move better, so much faster. They would remove a lot of the, motor pattern issues that were going to follow them for the next 6 years in the gym, and probably would have saved a huge percentage of injuries that would have that happened in the first year to 2 years for people.
And they'd probably end up looking better too,
Yeah.
More muscle.
Lot more abs.
These methods are all great. We like to kind of use and draw from all of them. But when it comes to like, where do you get the most bang for your buck or juice for your squeeze? Well, that can be contextual, but you have to look at what's working for most people, right? If you look at bodybuilders, the highest level, the people that are able to elicit lots of hypertrophy consistently, the one thing you see with them is heavy volume, right? So they're getting lots of repetition with lots of mechanical loading in controlled movement. This is the common player. This is really like home base. And then these avenues are different offshoots to go down. Like, not everything has to be heavy volume. These other tools are great to kind of mix it up and even assist in recovery in some places. But that's kind of the most bang for your buck place if you're talking about getting muscles to grow. Now, with that, and we were just talking about muscle damage, we can now hit some of these ancillary questions, which is like, how much time do I need between body parts when I'm training them? And one of the things that comes along with muscle damage is usually some level of soreness, indicating an adaptation or healing process that's occurring inside the muscle. Some people call this DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. It occurs 24 to maybe 48 hours after a session. And it kind of begs the question, well, how much damage is too much damage and how much is not enough? So, in the case of DOMS, yeah, like, you don't have to be sore every time you train, but if you're never sore, that might point to but potentially not enough damage occurring to be able to get some of these responses. If you're so sore that like you did leg day and you can't walk for a week, that might point to too much, and that can actually inhibit muscle hypertrophy because the body goes into more of a preservation response. So, the right idea is like, you want to be a little bit sore, especially if you're doing dedicated hypertrophy sessions, but it shouldn't be crazy sore. There's obviously context there based on how trained you are. A new athlete might do a very little amount and be crazy sore. Their body's adapting. Someone like Marcus and I, who are highly trained, it's probably pretty hard to make us sore. So that's us pushing our volume and intensity in training. That can be influenced by things like your training age. So, I'm 38 years old, but I've been training for over 20 years. Somebody else may be 38 years old and has never trained before. That will obviously influence how much time they need to recover between sessions. And how long have you been doing purposeful resistance training, right? If this is the first time you're getting exposed to these types of methods. I like to do a split with athletes, and everyone's different. I like to do a split where we really don't hit specific body parts more than once or twice a week. So I work on a rotation of legs, chest, back, shoulders, and arms so that athletes are getting almost a full week recovery, maybe with additional work for lagging muscle groups. And when we do these, we really hammer the body parts so that we're creating enough damage and giving enough time for that remodeling to take place. Now, I know, Marcus, you probably have some interesting ideas about this. What's your take on recovery time and splits and how you like to organize this stuff?
You know, for me, I think what you just described is very much a classic bodybuilding approach, where it's like we're going to really give one part of the body a lot of attention. We're going to give it a lot of volume or a lot of intensity on a specific day, and then we want to give it plenty of time to recover before we come back to it. And now, on the other side of the spectrum, there's like the CrossFitter, who's like basically every day is leg day and every day is upper body day and every day is every body part day. So it's just you're constantly doing everything. I think that the way I kind of viewed it was there's a lot of value to having body part splits built into functional training programs, or at least bringing some awareness to what movement patterns and what body parts are getting hit on a Monday, and then not repeating that at least, you know, for a couple days, certainly within a generalized program that you're giving to like 100, 200, 300 people. Like we have to make an assumption that if somebody did, you know, 150 wall balls on Monday, it's not likely that they're going to be able to come back on Tuesday and have any effective leg training. So why not label Monday a, you know, knee flexion day and then not come back to it until Thursday or Friday? So that's something that influences, you know, my sort of general prescriptions for programs, is looking at even within a functional training program or a GPP program, saying, if squats happened on Monday and we did some, let's say we did some hypertrophy work and we did a Metcon that had a lot of volume of air squats, I'm not going to touch that for several days after, until we come back to another, you know, leg session. Now there might be a bending day where we do hinge focus, where it's more deadlifting, more swings, more box jumps like that. Then there might be a day where it's very upper body focus. It's push presses. It's doing some strict press work. It's doing some pulling. And then to the point about the training age and, you know, how long have you really been doing purposeful resistance training? Something that I have seen generally is that, you know, if somebody's really new and they're, depending on the movement and depending on how much they're really able to connect to some of these principles of time under tension, it can be difficult for somebody who's brand new to even be able to lift enough, or to get I'm talking about like a true beginner, to be able to get like such a stimulus that they have DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness, for days, right? They might be able to come in, do a full body, you know, training split, rest a day, come back, do another full body, rest a day, come back, do another full body. So I like to think, you know, beginners can really handle maybe more full body training days in a week. As you get more trained, you're going to have to start splitting this up to a point where you might get, you know, very advanced. What Dave's talking about, it's like one body part a day, a week. And that's really all you can tolerate if you really can bring intensity. So
yeah, I like that. And like, you know, it kind of goes back to that, you know, Dr. Brad's remark, the body wants to survive. You know, if you're not used to doing anything and you just step foot in the gym, you know, that's going to be more than you're accustomed to. And so it's going to take a while. Maybe it only starts with like 2 or 3 days a week of training and it ramps up to 5, and then the intensity follows that. You know, with regard to those training splits, one thing I didn't mention was, you know, I know we're talking about just like the pure hypertrophy work, because I'm one of those coaches that likes to do the hybrid program where it's pure hypertrophy work, kind of the advanced bodybuilding concepts with functional movements. And then I do some kind of GPP conditioning. We call it anaerobic conditioning, high intensity intervals. And what I'll do is actually try to leverage the conditioning for recovery, because all of the healing factors that's going to help your muscles grow and remodel and recover come through blood flow. The healing factors are in the blood. The growth factors are in the blood. So what I like to do is do conditioning on a 2-day delay to tax that body part again, but instead of heavy mechanical loading and breaking it down, it's really about blood flow. So maybe if leg day was on Monday, maybe on Wednesday, we're doing some more high rep wall balls. And not only are we getting more leg training, but it's a different kind of leg training that's all about just bringing some healing factors into the legs or into the arms. The same with the pressing functions. I find that that kind of is a way to kill two birds with one stone almost, because now you're not just getting some good conditioning in, but you're almost getting some therapeutic blood flow factors with that conditioning that, you know, I just found advantageous for me as an athlete. And for our athletes out there, I know that this stuff can be very damaging. So you need to take proactive steps to help yourself recover. Anything you can do, whether it's sleep or different types of therapies. I know we could kind of go down a real rabbit hole with all that, but the point is being proactive about your recovery enhances your results. And at the end of the day, that's the only thing that matters. You know, whether you should do a training split of, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or push-pull legs and push-pull or vice versa, that's completely dependent on whether you're getting results or not. And if you're not getting results, I recommend you change something. In most cases, when people aren't getting results, it means that they're probably not getting enough recovery, or they're not getting enough intensity out of that hypertrophy work to force the adaptation.
Dave, I have a question for you, and this is based upon the experience that I had as a CrossFit athlete and knowing what a lot of CrossFit athletes do. There's a massive amount of aerobic work. So submaximal aerobic training, just putting in hours and hours and hours on bike, run, swim, row, whatever. And that's a tool to not only build your aerobic capacity as an athlete, but it was a tool to recover. I know that you were just talking about getting blood flow. Blood flow is the key to muscle recovery. And so when I was doing CrossFit competitively, you know, getting on the assault bike for an hour at low intensity was always a great way to kind of help heal and get out of that muscle soreness and that funk that I was in. So I guess the question, or I was curious about, was like during a cutting phase in a bodybuilding program where you might be ramping up, you know, your fasted cardio, your steady state cardio to increase, you know, your caloric deficit. Do you find that you actually recover your muscles? Do you recover a little bit better, or is there any change that you experience to muscle recovery during that time?
So, you know, typically in a cut, we're attacking the body from two different sides. We're operating a caloric deficit and increasing the training frequency. So the output demand is higher and the fuel is less. Yeah, I totally feel like if right now I tried to train that much, I feel like I'd be really, really sore because, you know, I'm not used to it. But the higher volume training as you adapt to it, I think that recovery accelerates only if you're good at managing what that frequency looks like. So if it's lifting on lifting on lifting, that might be a little too much. What I like to do with cutting is kind of balance a hypertrophy strength training session that I will intentionally feed around and place most of my calories around for the sake of getting an anabolic effect or being able to preserve as much muscle mass as I can when I cut. And then I'll go into a fasted, either lighter depletion workout. That's just kind of, you can call it light CrossFit or light interval work, or a steady state cardio. And, you know, those are really, they're regenerative, right? It's the same stuff I would program on the weekends for active recovery or regen. It's just now serving a different purpose. It's eating calories that I'm intentionally trying to pull muscle glycogen from. And, you know, another conversation that Marcus and I have had is just understanding the balance between, you know, anabolic muscle building work and what can sometimes be catabolic, just purely aerobic work. And there is kind of this balance where even if you're doing aerobic work, there are ways to disguise anabolic signals in there through, instead of just pure steady state, it can be some type of light weightlifting. Marcus was using the example of like, yeah, I would do like hundreds of kettlebell swings. So it was like cardio weightlifting, but you're still getting more of an anabolic signal than if you're just walking uphill for 2 hours. So yeah, there's lots of different ways you can kind of manipulate that, is my point. Cool. Okay, I told you we're going to go down rabbit holes here, man.
Yeah.
Okay, here's some good ones. These are some common questions we get. I think the answers are going to be a little shorter, but here's a common question. My weight seems to always stick in the same place. What should I do? And this is for the athlete who's like, I'm trying to put on muscle mass. I see a lot of these guys who maybe have a crazy high activity level, maybe an endurance athlete, or just as an example, potentially, but kind of like, you know, maybe that 165 pound guy who's dying to get to 185 and they're just sticking there. The first question I would ask that person is, do you really want it? right? Because unfortunately, I think people assume that gaining weight should be easy, and it's not easy. It's probably harder in my mind than cutting, because you have to force yourself to get uncomfortable with a surplus of food. So, your basal metabolic rate plus your activity kind of determines your baseline calories of what you need to sustain. But to be able to gain mass, you need to eat a caloric surplus, which is more than that. And it can be very uncomfortable, especially if your activity is very high and you have a fast metabolism. You really need to force the food down. So for me, it's really just about finding the right caloric balance and then making sure that the training matches up like that. Like if you just eat a caloric surplus and you train like a cupcake, you'll put on size, but it might not be the right type of size, right? You want to put on muscle mass. So those two things in conjunction seem to really create success. And I know Marcus has some good points on this too, in terms of how to create that accuracy.
I mean, making sure that the note that I wrote down was that you have to get measurable immediately. People say, like, I can't seem to put on any mass. And I say, okay, well, please send me your food journals. And they're like, I don't have any. And I'm like, well, how the heck do you know what you're actually doing? What are your inputs? What are your outputs? It's difficult to actually and accurately predict how many calories you need on a daily basis to maintain and to gain and to cut. But what isn't arguable is if you record exactly what you did for 3 weeks in a row and we get some real hard data with like as much accuracy as you can put into that log, we can get some averages and we can start to say, well, what changed in your body? We can start to look at this like scientists. So I think that, while I don't want every single person in the world to be married to a, calorie tracker and a macronutrient tracker, if that's not what they're after, if you start to talk about body composition change and gaining weight or losing weight, you need to be a scientist about it. And the people that accidentally put on 10 pounds of muscle, I don't know them. The people that accidentally lost 20 pounds of fat and preserved all their muscle, I don't know who those people are. It's a very strategic and purposeful path. And like Dave said, you have to really want it. I don't care which direction you're going. If you want to get bigger or you want to like reduce body fat, it takes a real level of commitment that almost borders on obsession. And to the outside community, people that are surrounding you, if they're not in that mindset themselves, they're going to challenge you all the time. They're going to say, why are you doing that? That looks crazy. That's, you're too obsessed with this thing. And you will have to fight a little bit of that current because they can't understand the level of commitment that it takes to put on that muscle. So, yeah, again, it's back to what I was saying. It's just getting measurable right away about your food, your training, and your recovery, taking notes. Every bodybuilder that was successful has a training journal that is very detailed. And so that's not by mistake.
Yeah. And, those are basic things there. And, it kind of always comes back to Dr. Schoenfeld. It's survival, right? I mean, the body wants one thing. It wants homeostasis, and getting uncomfortable is winning the battle against stagnation. And getting uncomfortable might look like how you're training. It might look like how you're eating. The three major players with regard to muscle growth are going to be nutrition, training, and your body's internal chemistry, directly influenced by recovery, and a lot of those other factors too. So, not getting measurable, maybe not just even on the food, but getting measurable on your training, getting blood work. That's really important. Looking at hormone panels, cardiometabolic panels. These are ways for you to try to optimize to essentially create a quicker, more efficient path for yourself to get there. And even then, you need to set realistic expectations. I think people have the idea of like, I can put 20 pounds of muscle on in a year. That ain't happening. You may put on 20 pounds of size, but with any mass gain is going to come usually almost equal parts in body fat to muscle mass, unless you're completely untrained. Like if you're morbidly obese and you start training, I believe that you can lose body fat and gain muscle mass because you're completely untrained. But if you're someone like most of you who are probably trained, you might be looking at somewhere along the lines of 3 to 5 pounds of muscle gain a year if you're trying hard. And my weight fluctuates drastically. For a show, I may be 220 pounds. In an off season, I may be 257. And even in that fluctuation of a year based on the total mass, I'm really only gaining about 5 pounds of muscle each year. And that's pushing it in every single level with nutrition and training and blood work and you name it. So have realistic expectations. That also allows you to feel successful, creating small goals that are checkpoints, because if you say like, hey, I want to gain, 20 pounds of muscle in a couple months, and you don't, you might feel defeated. And then you start hopping from program to program, and nutrition principle to nutrition principle. And a lot of this is just about consistency and pushing. That's really what it boils down. Okay, here's a common one. Go ahead, Mark.
No, I was going to go right into the next question, but and it's how do I stay lean while building muscle? And this is actually what it actually kind of ties into the last question, which is that many people want to gain muscle, but they're not really ready to put on body fat to go with it. So if you want to get into an aggressive muscle building cycle of training, there's going to be, like Dave said, some body fat that comes along with it. And then you're going to have to go through a process of cutting that back. For those people that don't want to go through that process of adding a lot of extra body fat and they want to just gain lean muscle, you need to really consider that you're going to have to stretch out your expectations of how long it's going to take to grow muscle. You want to grow a lot of muscle fast, pack on some fat. If you want to grow muscle without any fat, then it's going to happen slowly. And some of the ways that I've experienced this, and my experience through this was basically since I was 15 years old, I was going to the gym and trying to put muscle on my body. And that's 20 years of training now. And the periods of time where I experienced the most, noticeable growth in muscle tissue was when I went for the first time in my life, when I actually went to a very, very high training volume. So I was, I was training in sports and in the weight room and doing bodybuilding programs, but it was always about the same amount of training. And then I got into CrossFit, was a team athlete, still not that much training, right? Still not that much volume, because this was pre like the current era of CrossFit. And then I was like, I'm going to jump into individual competition. And I was training maybe 12 hours a week, and that bumped up to 20 to 24 hours a week. And so in a span of 2 years, I increased my training volume by like 100%. And my body went from 185 at regionals on a team in 2012 to 195 pounds, close to 200 pounds at the 2014 CrossFit Games as an individual. And my body composition did not dramatically change. It was just a lot of added volume. So how do I stay lean? My answer to people is I would say you have to increase your training volume dramatically and be eating in a caloric surplus on top of that, because people will often say, okay, I got to train more to get bigger. They train more, they don't eat more, and they end up shrinking as a result.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer.
Tell them how fat I would get every winter to get stronger.
Cammy would put on a lot. She would get big in all the right places. Okay, that's neither here nor there. Yeah, I mean, like, obviously that's going to be slower. That's what it bottoms down to, because we're not just signaling anabolism, storage, and synthesis of protein to grow muscle tissue, but we're trying to kind of find that balance in there. This is often termed as things like recomp, so staying the same mass but hardening up and increasing muscle mass. And some people are like, you're replacing muscle with body fat. Like, I don't know if that's actually what's occurring, but you're definitely eating some fat and trying to slowly gain muscle. Or in the case of like a hard gainer, like I'm going to gain, but I'm going to gain a little slower, and there's a little bit of recomposition potentially happening as I do it. The first thing you would probably want to look at is your caloric balance. I know that, for deficits, I usually start athletes off at 12 calories per pound of body weight to kind of use that as a litmus test for is the deficit enough, more or less. For say something like staying in place, you might push up higher towards 15 calories per pound of body weight per day. But that's very contextual to the athlete's current level of body fat, their activity level, and their genetics, male, female, young or old. So you have to play with that. It's just kind of cool to have starting points to know, is this more or less? And I use that word litmus test because it doesn't mean just because you start there, you stay there. You have to observe. So that's one. Another way you can do this is just kind of like Marcus was saying, like balancing the frequency of training or the anaerobic work with the aerobic work, so that you're sending some fat mobilizing signals. This can be done by stimulating a hormone called glucagon, a fat mobilizing hormone. You can stimulate through restriction of carbohydrates or even fasting. Also great to do, like if you were doing something like fasted cardio in the morning with BCAAs. This is a great way to stimulate glucagon to pull fat and mobilize glycogen, but then also feeding and creating that anabolic signal maybe around the heavier lifting. So I like things like intermittent fasting. I like things like fasted cardio, or Marcus is talking about increasing training volume, but the caloric balance needs to be right so that you're still making progress, whether it's recomp or hard gainer. And obviously hard gainer would probably be more calories than recomp. That only makes sense if you're gaining weight, you need more fuel to do that. Cool. Yeah. Firing up the engine while you build. And, these hormones we talk about, like maybe you guys have heard them before. It's not really as complex as it kind of comes off. The words are fancy, but really what we're saying is like, are you creating a state where you're catabolic a little bit, right? Where you're forcing yourself to pull fat, and then balancing that with a state where you're anabolic or building up and trying to gain muscle. And what does that balance look like? Again, contextual to the athlete and all their circumstantial profiles. Okay, cool. Hey, here's a good one, Marcus. Trying to cut. What should my training and nutrition look like?
I'm going to start with that last point there because that's something that just got a lot of exposure to. Like a lot of people came into the CrossFit gym. I want to lose body fat. I want to look better, and ran into a ton of problems when they did too much high intensity mixed modal training. It was variables that were difficult to control. So what we're talking about in a lot of this work is that when we do hypertrophy training principles, there's a lot of control that we can have in what we're putting in terms of the volume of contractions, the frequency, the rest periods. Like everything can be structured in a way where we have control over the program as coaches. Whereas if you say we're going to do 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 of these 4 movements, and you let 10 people do it, you're going to get 10 different workouts that are happening. And so it's difficult to know, like, how intense was that for that person? Like, what did they burn in the way of calories? Like, I just don't know. So that is one thing that I try and tell people about training is like, hey, if you want to really cut body fat, let's minimize the number of variables that are out there, and let's cut back on a little bit of the high intensity mixed modal training. It's also going to allow you to have a better relationship with food, because one thing that I think anybody's experienced it knows, you go in and do a high intensity Metcon that just makes you want to pass out and throw up. Like it's somewhere down the line that day, you are going to have massive sugar cravings that hit you. And that's going to be difficult when you're trying to maintain some caloric deficit, which is going to be necessary if you're trying to shed body fat.
Yeah, I totally agreed. And like, one thing we haven't even talked about, which is kind of cool, I like what you were speaking to about like training volume, is just understanding like what should hypertrophy training volume look like for most. And I know we all may have varying opinions on that based on how much hypertrophy you're doing versus high intensity training. But in my view, the sweet spot I found with a lot of people is kind of that 16 to 20 set range, kind of that 200 to 300 rep range. That is kind of like a good amount of volume for hypertrophy, just in terms of getting enough to really target that and get a response. And even that, that can take anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes. That again now complements, in a lot of cases, a hybrid program where there's even conditioning workout on top of that. So, the thing Marcus does really well is he understands the stress response that's things like high intensity training occur. And there are lots of different ways to skin a cat, but in a lot of cases, less is more. More high intensity training may be spiking cortisol and inhibiting your ability to grow muscle or to burn fat. So, I think that there's dramatically much more of a capacity for people to handle higher volumes of bodybuilding work, like we said, versus high volumes of intensity work every single day, working out till you puke. You're going to run into a wall there eventually, a plateau, injury, or worse. But it just can't be pedal to the metal every day.
That's been the overwhelming response from people that have done, my programs, our programs, and particularly the one that we released. It was about 4 years ago, almost 3.5 years ago, Awaken Training Series, which was my first program that I put out that was really a hybrid of, some bodybuilding principles and some CrossFit. But by and large, it was just like for the average person coming out of a competitive training mindset or a CrossFit general programming mindset was like, well, this is a lot less intense. And I was like, hey, just please just stick with it. They're like, well, can I add more stuff in? I'm like, no, don't add more stuff in. And then as the weeks and then the months went on, it was like, wow, I not only do I feel better, but I'm looking way better than I ever did before. And I'm not even hurting as bad as I used to every single day. I'm not hitting the high intensity that I did every single day. And again, that was a big generalization about a lot of people that did the program, but it just kind of speaks to this, where it's like, if you're putting in too much intensity, more is not always better. Sometimes less is more. And particularly when we're talking about the variables that we can't control, when you start to do that too much, it gets into hormones, it gets into, relationship to food, again, more survival stuff.
Yeah. And I love, I think these principles you and I both adopt. I think this is the common theme that we both know and understand and are trying to spread to people. And even within that, our spinoffs are a little different. I think I'm probably a little heavier on the bodybuilding. You're probably a little heavier on the performance and orthopedic safety. And even in answering questions, it's funny how our answers go in different directions, where you might answer a little closer towards human performance, and my head goes to answering, in terms of maybe a CrossFitter who's thinking about getting on stage one day. My answers are more geared towards aesthetics and the biological adaptations, and still we're talking about the same thing. That's awesome. Okay, here's a good one. Trying to cut, what should my training and nutrition look like? So we talked about, the weight gain question, right? It really is flipping that answer on its head. Now, instead of operating in a caloric surplus, we're operating in a caloric deficit. And with this, you're consuming less fuel than your mass needs to sustain. So obviously there'll be a reduction of mass. You can do this a lot of different ways. So obviously calories are very important, overall calories, but even macronutrient balance. And one thing that I like to do with athletes who are trying to cut is manipulate the macronutrients so they're not getting as many storage signals throughout the day. So we restrict carbohydrates. Carbohydrates break down into glucose, which can cause, the secretion of insulin, a storage hormone. So we just try to limit that by flipping a ratio where instead of, we might normally go 40% carbohydrates in a regular maintenance or gaining program, we go to 40% protein for the sake of stimulating glucagon and reducing the insulin response, along with a caloric deficit, which is going to be progressive because athletes will adapt. Even in our program we have now, it's a 30-day shred program. Athletes in the first week lost, anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds that first week. And the second week, it's already starting to get sticky where they need more to continue to progress. So it's kind of that continual push, along with a continual push in training frequency to continue your body to force to pull. We mentioned things like intermittent fasting. That's a great way to stimulate glucagon, to pull from fat, to pull from muscle glycogen and deplete. Setting a baseline of calories slightly below your maintenance. And I know this is something that Marcus talks about. We may have different ideas about it. I personally like to start athletes at that 12 calorie per pound of body weight, depending on their demographic, and then use that as kind of the test for how much do we need to progress. Some cases we'll do a rotation where we have increasing deficits or potentially even refeed days based on how they respond to that.
You're the man on that, dude, for sure.
I'm looking. Marcus had another really good note. He's like, avoiding too much high intensity. Naps. One thing I found in preparing for show, that naps were amazing because you're not eating when you're napping. You're not thinking about food, right? So that's good. Also good for reducing the cortisol. That helps all those really good hormones you're trying to stimulate, growth hormone, testosterone, all those things really important for being able to pull from fat and maintain your muscle mass. The bottom line with cutting is that I don't think at a certain point, it's just not fun. It's just not fun. And it really has to be uncomfortable. And usually the more uncomfortable you're getting, the leaner you're getting. So it's a process of not just adapting to the lower calories, but adapting to being depleted and deprived. I've done things like try to go down different strategies to be able to manage hunger. One thing I really like is just trying to make it to 2 p.m. before any big meals hit, using things like coffee and MCT oil and collagen to stave off hunger and maintain mental acuity, because without carbs, you get kind of dumb and irritable. But that's all part of it, and I think the one thing you're kind of hearing again is just what we're talking about with adaptation. Your body wants to survive. It's not going to be comfortable. And usually the more severe and uncomfortable it gets, the more compelling the results are.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to note that, like, you talk about getting uncomfortable with certain signals that your body is giving you. And when you're cutting, you're basically, your body signaling you like, hey, you're starving. This is really bad. This is a bad situation. How comfortable can you get with that? Similarly, when you're trying to bulk, like, you're going to be uncomfortable eating all this food. Like, you're going to have, your gut's going to be full. You're going to have belly distension. You're going to be trying to bend over, and you're going to just feel that food in your stomach as you're trying to fold over and pick up the thing off the floor. And, originally that's going to be really difficult for you. And then you can acclimate to what that feeling is like and get a little bit more comfortable with it as time goes on, which kind of means that the initial portion, or the first time doing something, is going to be tough. I remember the first time I did, a real, like, attempt at cutting, it was like, holy smokes, like, I am hungry. Like, this is really hard. And then fortunately that should come with some result that gets you inspired to keep going. It's like, oh, I'm hungry, but I see my abs for the first time. Oh, I see, a new striation in this. And so that kind of feeds the psychological, process that you're gonna have to go through, but it's going to be uncomfortable at first. And all the tricks and the tips and the ways to navigate that discomfort, they're not always the healthiest choices. Let's just be, honest. Like, you're going through a cut and you're trying to, like, use caffeine to kind of suppress appetite, and you're drinking 10 cups of coffee a day. It has to be for a purpose, right? And you have to understand that there has to be an endpoint to that purpose. You're not going to cut indefinitely for the rest of your life.
It's not an inevitable process, especially if you're doing it hard. I mean, like, I have horror stories with Camille, with me just snapping at her, coming home and lying in the fetal position and crying during steady state cardio. It's just all the stuff. But again, like, I encourage, there she goes, she's chiming in. I encourage athletes, like, when you're doing this, just that first question, like, do you really want it? And remember your why. And just like you adapt to training, you adapt to these stresses where you get comfortable with it. What starts as your baseline deficit is no problem by the end of the cut. It's easy peasy, and even after you do a hard cut like that, when you say come back to it a month or a couple months or a couple of years later, even, you're okay because you're familiar with that discomfort, right? Like, I've been through this before. It's all right. It's not a big deal. You know how to handle it better. Cool.
Well, should we wrap on this next question about performance versus aesthetics and just eating for those two?
Yeah. And I think we can, I mean, dude, I think we can kind of pull together questions 10, 11, and 12 all in one. I have a short answer for 10, but I'll let you head this one up. The question is, like, how does eating for performance differ from eating for aesthetics? We go down a line of just, looking at some different diets: carnivore, keto, vegan, zone, macros, and what supplements should I take? So, here's my basic, really short answer on the difference. If you're training for performance, you don't need to push the same way you need to push calories up or pushing calories down if you're training for aesthetics. Because the idea is to just give your body exactly what it needs. It doesn't need more. It doesn't need less. I find that training for performance often includes more fat, because that's great for performance. When you're training for aesthetics, usually the fat is lower because you're trying to speed up the metabolism and speed up the speed of digestion. So that may be a little bit lower. But in essence, the difference is you have the ability to give your body what it needs and wants, and you don't really need to push very hard in one direction or another.
Yeah, I was going to just say that, performance eating is about optimizing recovery time so that you can come back and train as hard and as, efficiently and effectively as possible the next day. And I think in the performance world, one of the biggest things that we end up seeing is people under eating, and under eating in a performance world is really, going to halt your progress. And it's going to be the thing that can lead to injury, and it can lead to overtraining very fast. So, it's about making sure that you're hitting that balance of, like, this is what I need every single day, not necessarily being so concerned on, like, what the it's like, outside of maybe getting enough protein and sufficient carbohydrates to replenish muscle glycogen, there's not really, like, that. You don't have to get so specific on the macronutrient balance that you're having. It's more a product of just caloric intake. Of course, the quality of food, I think, really matters in both cases. From a performance standpoint, I really harp on quality, certainly because when we start to look at higher quality foods, we're getting more micronutrients, which is supporting other, recovery and restorative factors inside of our bodies. But yeah, it's like, you shouldn't be worrying about cutting or being on a caloric deficit or in a massive caloric surplus. Even when you're going through strength cycles in a performance training setting, you don't need to be in these, big swings one way or the other.
Yeah, and you want a healthy amount of body fat to perform your best. Cam would always talk about her power pooch because, fat is a fuel source when you're depleted, and it helps you, even neurologically, having fat in your system can increase your mental acuity, all that stuff. So, it's not just about aesthetics. And even on the device, like carrying around excess muscle, if we're talking about CrossFit, like there's a reason why there are no 250-pound CrossFitters at the CrossFit Games, because that's not like, obviously that's more of a focused on the aesthetic of it, not necessarily whether it, speaks to a broad scope of fitness, especially at that level. So yeah, it just kind of depends on what you want,
Yeah. There was definitely a talk a lot about in the coaching circle that I was in. We were doing CrossFit competitions, and performance was that there's a certain level of leanness that you can get to where it starts to become detrimental to your ability to perform because your body gets to a certain survival mode. Like think about when women at reproductive age, it's like if they get too lean, the body shuts down the reproductive system because it's not fit to bear a child. And similarly, when you're out performing, you want to go and do this incredible, amazing, stressful feat like the CrossFit Games, but you're coming in at 4% body fat and caloric deficit. Your body is going to shut down in ways. So that was commonly discussed. Despite what you see, like, oh, man, these CrossFitters are lean. It's like, yeah, but if they were leaner, they wouldn't be so good.
Yeah, and then you have the question like about all the individual diet spinoffs, the carnivore diet, intermittent fasting, the keto diet, the paleo diet, vegan, zone versus macros. And what I can say is that every one of these diets has a context, but you should understand what the benefits are and what the drawbacks are. So in the example of, let's say, the carnivore diet or the keto diet, this is a great diet because we're restricting carbohydrates for, say, increasing insulin sensitivity. That could work really well for somebody with metabolic disorder, right? Who doesn't have good insulin sensitivity. Obviously, there's a context there. It doesn't, however, include carbohydrates, which are probably the most efficient fuel source for athletic activity and certainly important for muscle growth because you want an insulin response when you're eating. So there's kind of the benefits and drawbacks. The same thing, we're kind of splitting hairs with zone versus macros. I think the important thing with both of those is the food quality and making sure that the quantities are correct. So whether you measure it with a yardstick or a tape measure, it doesn't really matter as long as you're measuring. Do you have anything on that, Marcus?
No, not beyond what you said. I just think that each of these diets are a different way of approaching, different problems, and none of them can solve every single problem that's out there, and that you have to really determine what's going to work best for you. And, I do like something that, Ryan Fisher, our buddy, he's big into like carb cycling and even keto programs. And, he's like, look, if you want to get lean, you're going to have to go into a caloric deficit, and you need to find something that is sustainable for you to be able to do that repeatedly. It's like, this is what works for me, and it's what works for a lot of people. And if going paleo gets you there, great. For many people, paleo meant that they were going to eat all the bacon in the planet, and they just went into a massive caloric surplus. Like, why didn't I lose weight like Joe did? So you have to, again, just understand that these are different tools, but until you look at your own situation, your goals, and you individualize it for yourself, it's hard to say, hey, this is best. This isn't going to work.
Yeah, and something like paleo, sure, that could work for a cut because you don't need a high density of carbohydrates. But like if I was trying to gain muscle mass and I had to eat 500 grams of carbohydrates a day, I'm probably not getting that from fruits and vegetables. If it's happening that way, I'm probably giving myself diarrhea. So it's like, obviously there's a time and place. Now, the supplement stuff, guys, I know everyone kind of has like ideas about supplements. I want to broaden this for you just to give you the basics. In my view, the best supplement you can take is just getting a good whole foods diet and making sure you're getting what you need from a full diet in the right amounts and being able to process it. So some of the supplements that Marcus and I recommend kind of have a common theme where it's all about maximizing your ability to absorb macro and micronutrients in a diet. And one of my favorite ones, because I like diets with very, very high or higher than people are used to protein amounts, anywhere in that, 1 gram per pound of body weight to even 2 grams per pound of body weight per day range in grams of protein. I recommend things like kidney support because kidneys need to process this. So there are really great kidney support supplements. Cranberry is a really good one. There are some awesome companies. If you usually Google kidney support, you'll find something really good in there. Liver support, also really important for being able to process the high amounts of protein. Protein powders for being able to hit your macronutrient marker. So I know that obviously, you're not going to eat protein powder all day, but it's a way to supplement. So you don't need to get 300 grams of protein from meat alone, and water intake too. It's your filtration process for being able to filter through your kidneys. I like to prescribe everything from 1.5 to even 2 gallons a day. If you have a high protein diet, and this is all for the sake of achieving a positive nitrogen balance, getting enough protein in there so that you can heal and remodel, so protein synthesis can occur, so you can grow muscle. Marcus, you had some cool ones in there with regard to digestive health.
Yeah, I mean, it just piggybacks on what you said. It's all about what gets the most out of our food possible, and you're not going to be able to supplement your way through a poor quality under eating diet. And so I kind of lean into digestive health supplements, things that will keep the microbiome really healthy in our guts. So the bacterial colonies that are there that impact digestion, they impact how we interact with foods, our inflammation. So taking probiotics, even using for some people, digestive enzymes or hydrochloric acid, supplementing with those. If you're eating a lot of protein, one, you should be chewing that protein really well so that it can actually break down before it gets into your stomach, and you have a chance at actually absorbing those nutrients and those amino acids without really putting too much stress on your stomach and your gallbladder. But something like hydrochloric acid, in a supplement form, if maybe you don't produce enough or you're eating big copious amounts of protein, it can help to break that down and aid in that process. So what Dave said, along with some digestive health supplements, could be a really good combination for sort of making sure that you're going to be eating, a lot of protein. You're going to be eating perhaps a lot of food. If you're trying to go through hypertrophy and build, then we want to make sure that you're actually supporting the systems underneath that are helping to break that down and get it into your system and get it into your body for utilization.
Yeah, and I think I'm a big fan of blood work. I get blood work, every 2 or 3 months I'm getting blood work just to see, the internal chemistry and what's actually happening inside. The blood work you would look to get would be a cardiometabolic panel and a full hormone panel. And what the cardiometabolic panel will tell you is it'll show you your liver enzyme levels. It'll show the stress on your kidneys in the form of ALT and AST. And you can kind of see, just making sure that you're still within a good range, even if you're pushing the protein, because over-proteination, right, can cause stress. But in most cases, I think people way underestimate how much protein they can handle. And what's really required. So you may be surprised. There's some great books out there like Protein Power, which is like, no one, I don't think a lot of people haven't really pushed the protein that way to see what it can actually do for you. So, hey, Marcus, dude, I have so much fun talking with you. This is always great.
Yeah, this was a blast.
Yeah, I hope that you guys really enjoyed this. It's going to be recorded. We have all your information. You're going to be able to kind of download this recording and take a look back at it. And this course that we're in now, this is kind of just a seminal broad scope of some areas that Marcus and I kind of do spin-offs and dive into. So hopefully this is the first teaser in a series we are going to potentially do, diving into each one of these individual categories where we can take a closer look at methods and programming and do kind of more examples for you as coaches or athletes to get this kind of continuing education and development. And I can say, whether you're on the coach's side or the athlete side, it always makes you better to know more. In CrossFit, we use this analogy of the black box, like where we have an input and there's this black box and you don't know what happens, but we know that by doing thrusters and burpees, you lose body fat. Well, I believe that it's important to know what's going on inside the black box. And understanding these mechanisms allows you to target them better and more appropriately within your training, or if you're prescribing them for athletes.
Yeah, coaches for sure. And then athletes, we have a thing at Functional Bodybuilding, we call it the thinking athlete. And when athletes know more, they can get the right training stimulus, the right intent, the right dose out of what they're being prescribed. So I think it's essential that, we're here trying to raise the collective awareness and knowledge, and it's fun for us. It's been, so impactful for both of us in our own training and our own journeys through fitness to know more. That's why we keep learning, and we love to teach it to people, because it helps us to know, even deeper what the principles, feel like for ourselves, is to teach it to others. So we certainly welcome lots of questions. Any feedback that you have on this, send it our way. It will inform what you want to hear more about. And if there were aspects of this that really sung, we're hitting you in your core, and you're like, man, I need to know more about that. We want to hear that.
Yeah, and I think Marcus and I both understand that there's a difference between information and knowledge. Information is something that you read in a book or you hear at a webinar. Knowledge is you actually doing it, right? Actually spending the time in the trenches, experimenting with yourself, making the mistakes, understanding what works. So, these tools are great, but the idea is you need to run with them and experiencing them to really understand them and turn this information into knowledge. So Marcus, where can people find you and your programs, your website? Give them kind of the resources if they're kind of interested in maybe messaging you or anything.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, I mean, we if you've signed up for this, we're going to be reaching out to you to just make a touch point, make sure you get this recording. But certainly, go to revival-strength.com. That's where all of our functional bodybuilding programs live. Talk about wanting to take the the knowledge and go and implement it and actually try and experiment with it. That's where you can go find our stuff. I'm at Marcus Philly on Instagram and at functional.bodybuilding. You can send us messages, send me direct messages. I answer all of those too. But yeah, like Dave said, I think it's important that, you don't just listen to these things, but that you go and implement them and try them. And we've got sample workouts on our website that you can go pull, and you can go see, what was Marcus talking about when he said, put bodybuilding movements into a conditioning workout. Oh, well, they're right there for you to go try. So go give it a whirl.
Awesome. And I'm at Dave freaking Lipson. You can also go to our handle at Thundrbro, and our website is www.thundrbro.com. So it's Thun Dr. Bro. There's no E in Thunder. It's on purpose. For bro science meets real science. And you can find all of our programs. We also have a library of books that we've written with pre-written programs and a lot about muscle building theory. But, our most popular program, Muscle Anarchy, is kind of the hybrid one we always talk about. We also have our 30-day shred challenges and just as many resources for you as possible. So any way that we can help you, please reach out to us. I know Marcus and I, our passion is just putting good information out there and being of service to athletes, and just kind of trying to under-promise and over-deliver to you. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Marcus, I always have such a blast with you, dude. And
thank you so much, Dave. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for listening in, and we will see you next time.
We're only 40 minutes over, so I think we're going to skip it. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, just message us. I'm sure we covered some of that stuff. And thank you for the messages I'm reading in the chat. Thank you guys for the thanks and everything. This has been a pleasure and something that I know we both really enjoyed. Thank you guys.
Sweet. See you all.
Awesome, dude. I'll see you, Marcus. Thank you, everybody. Be safe. Be responsible, and let us know how we can help you.